Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on probabilistic production forecasting and being optimistic and overconfident over and over again with Reidar Brattvoll. I'm obviously not Reidar Brattvoll. My name is Mathias Carlsen, and I'll be moderating the session today. Just like Reidar, I'm also Norwegian, so hopefully he has a strong accent just as myself when we go through this. Before Reidar will go through his presentation today, we'll go through a few meeting logistics. First and foremost, we have more than 200 registered participants today, so everybody is by default muted. But that doesn't mean that you can't ask questions. So in the Q&A box to the right of the screen, you can add any question that you want, and just make sure to ask the questions in the Q&A box, because there's also a chat box there, and it's much easier for us to keep track of the questions that come in if you use the Q&A box right there. The presentation will be around 45 to 60 minutes, followed by a Q&A session where we go through the questions that have been asked throughout the presentation. And the presentation will be recorded and distributed after the fact. It will be available on Whitson Academy and on our YouTube channel. And for those of you who don't know what Whitson Academy is, that's an online subscription platform for petroleum engineering training content, where we both provide live virtual courses, live topical webinars such as this, and also a lot of pre-demand or on-demand pre-made courses. So how-to videos, for instance, of how to use different softwares, etc. A few examples of the courses that we provide is within the realm of what we do at Whitson, so a lot of things related to PVT, EOR, gas condensates, and well performance, and we try to cater for all levels from beginner to expert. If you go into whitson.com/training, you can also see the online courses that we offer this year, both on the software side and also just in terms of our public courses on different industry topics. And you can also find an overview over the next webinar. So next webinar coming up is already next month with Jorge Acuna about fractional dimension RTA. So with that, I would like to introduce the speaker today. So we're very happy to present Reidar Brattvoll, which is a professor of petroleum investment and decision analysis at the University of Stavanger, and also at NTNU, or the Norwegian Institute of Technology. He's actually a 3 times SBE distinguished lecturer, and I didn't even know that was possible, but apparently it is, and it's really, really impressive. And he holds numerous technical awards, both inside and outside of SBE, and he's also very known for writing the SBE book, Making Good Decisions, together with Steve Begg. In terms of education, he has a PhD from Stanford University, and also he studied business and management science education at INSEAD. And before he joined academia, he spent 15 years in various technical and management roles in the industry. So he was a VP in Landmark, which a lot of you most likely know. He was also a managing director in Smedvig Technology, which got looked into Roxar and is now a part of Emerson. He was a senior scientist at IBM and also a reservoir engineer at Statoil, or what is now Equinor. So with that, Reidar, I'll stop talking and stop sharing my screen, and then I'll make you a presenter and you take it from there. There we go. So now you should have the presenter rights, Reidar.
Thank you. Thank you for that invitation, Matthias, and I'm quite pleased to be here. Topic today is on production forecasting, and Matthias referred to the fact that I used to work with Statoil, now Equinor, back in the mid-80s, and my first job at that time was actually to do production forecasting in a team of 3, where we did forecasted the production for a not yet developed or even decided to develop field called Gullfaks B. So we used a newly bought reservoir simulator, the latest and greatest, at that time called Eclipse, brand new thing, corner point geometry, full implicit, the most fantastic thing you could imagine. And it did everything in double precision. So every year we produced a production number to 16 decimal digits. And we had this for 30 years into the future, a single number for every year. And the one thing I can assure you is that the Gulf XP platform never produced those numbers. That's absolutely for sure. And I should actually think that given what I now know, I think our forecast was a complete waste of time. I don't think it did any good to anybody. And if I had any sense, I should actually take whatever salary I had in that time period and send it back to Equinor. Anyway, so moving on to the topic at hand, we're going to talk about probabilistic production forecasting, and we started working on this in earnest about 4 years ago, and it's been a fantastic and very interesting journey, and I hope you also find this interesting. Erik Nesvold, whom you see here, is also a Stanford PhD. He's been a postdoc working with me now for almost 2 years, and he's done a good chunk of the analysis that we've done over the last year and a half or so. So let's start out by setting the context. So there's no value in and of itself to come up with good forecasts. What we really want to do is to create value in some way or form. And of course, value is one of these vague words, but value is a different thing to different people. So what is value to me is not necessarily the same as what's value to you, nor what's value to a oil and gas company or a non-profit organization, etc. But we want to maximize value in some sense. And in the oil and gas world, that's usually a monetary value and often measured as a net present value. But of course, the only way we can create value, whether for ourselves, our families, or in a corporate context, is through the decisions we make. There is no way to purposefully create value except by making decisions. And this, of course, emphasizes the importance of making high-quality decisions. These decisions are supremely important in our attempts to create value. And what is the one thing we know about decisions? They are about the future, aren't they? We never really make decisions about the past. Or let me change that. I really hope you don't waste any time trying to make decisions about the past. The past is the sunk cost, is done, can't really change it. So all decisions are about the future. And of course, what we know about the future is that it's uncertain, right? The future is always uncertain. Some things we know more about than other things, but there's always an element of uncertainty. And that means that we need to be good at dealing with uncertainty. We need to have uncertainty competence. And of course, in our world, certainly in the oil and gas world, that usually means being good at forecasting. So we need to be well calibrated in our forecasts. That's an absolutely essential requirement to make high quality decisions. And it's not the only required thing. There's a lot more than forecast or uncertainty competence that goes into high quality decisions. You see that 6-dimensional chain over on the right hand side. This is not the course on decision analysis. I'm not going to get into the details of this, but the forecast bit here, it really falls in this category here, relevant and reliable information, which is one element of this in the 6-dimensional world. So to sum up, what I'm trying to say here is that you can't really make good decisions without embracing uncertainty, and good decisions are a requirement for value creation. So given this context, the question is then, how good are we at embracing uncertainty? And today we're going to focus on the oil and gas industry. And the way we're going to evaluate this is by looking at empirical evidence from the Norwegian continental shelf. So the focus will be on the NCS, but I don't think the NCS is unique, or if the NCS is different from forecasts in other countries, I suspect it will tend to be in the upper 50%, better than in many other countries. And we're going to look at the production forecast performance for new oil fields, for the initial FID, final investment decision. So the new oil field development decisions, that's what we want to look at. Data For this, well, 125 fields have been developed on the shelf in this time period from 1972 through 2020. It's easy to think that this is only Statoil or Equinor. Well, that's not the case. As of today, there's about 20 to 25 or so operators actively operating on the NCS, and there are also several partners. So yes, Statoil/Equinor is an operator for many of these, but not for all of them. I think it's actually for less than 50% if you look at the time period here. In this case, we're lucky enough to have probabilistic forecast, starting as early as in 1995. So the Norwegian Petroleum Directorate, the guidelines that they provide, they specify that a triplet should be forecasted, representing a P10 mean and P90. And here I'm using the statistical P10 and P90s, right? So most of you may be used to having P90 as a low number and P10 as a high number. I'm using what's the common statistic nomenclature in this. So we have probabilistic forecasts, and not only do we have them, but they're required. That's a great thing. And I also think that that's quite unusual. It was certainly unusual if you go back almost 30 years. And then we have taken startup delays out of these forecasts. So many of these fields do not start up at the forecasted startup time. They start up at some later time, but we've taken that difference away. Well, that removes some of the production shortfall, which is due to topside problems or well scheduling issues and stuff like that. So what I'm showing you is actually going to be a positive picture of the situation. Reality is worse than what you will see in this presentation. Early on in particular, but also later on, some of these forecasts were inconsistent. We had forecasts where the P10 was higher than the mean, where the P10 was equal to the mean was equal to the P90, and I'm sure you've seen similar things in your company. So we had to remove some of the data here in order to select the data set that we could actually work with. So we ended up working with 72 fields, and here what I'm showing on the horizontal axis is the number of production years, and then you see the number of fields on the vertical axis. So we basically have 69 fields here with valid forecasts for the first 2 years. We have about 67 fields with valid forecasts for the first 3 years, and so on. And we're going to look at cumulative forecasts in this study. But you see here that if you got 10 years out, so fields with 10 years of production, about 35 or so fields in that part. And we're also not going to go further out in time. So you may ask, well, why don't you look at 15, 20, 30 years? Well, even 10 years is actually a long time in this situation. And why is that? There are two main reasons. One is that the main value measure, of course, the main decision measure or value measure is net present value. And net present value doesn't really care about the production 15 years out or even 10 years out. It cares a lot about production in the early time period because that is not being discounted. But as you go out in time, more and more is being discounted. So that's one reason why we focus in on the first 10 years. And another reason is that many of these fields, maybe even most of these fields, get additional funds at some point here. So when the companies discover that the fields or the wells are not producing what they had hoped they would produce, they add additional capex. They drill more wells, they do things to increase production. And of course, as soon as they spend more money than what was on the table at the time of the FID, we can't really compare the forecast anymore. So that's another reason why we're focusing in on the initial field life. Before we look at the data, we also need to talk a bit about what does a good forecast look like? And a good forecast in a deterministic world, which is completely uninteresting, is easy to define, isn't it? That's kind of like if you hit the bullseye, that's a good forecast. But that world doesn't exist. We live in a probabilistic world or an uncertain world, and these forecasts are probabilistic. So how do we know when a probabilistic forecast is good? Well, you can measure this in different ways. But if you look at the figure on the right-hand side here, you got the forecast in the blue, you got the produced volumes on the horizontal axis, and then you got the actual outcomes in orange. So one characteristic of a good forecast is that the range of the actual production, in other words, the range covered by the blue here, falls within the range of the, let me turn it around. The range of the actual outcomes, shown here under the orange, falls within the range of the forecasted outcomes, shown in the blue here. If too many of the actual outcomes fall outside, as indicated over here, that means that the forecaster is overconfident. So you want them to overlay with each other. Another measure is by looking at the average. So the average forecasted production should be equal to or close to the average of the actual outcomes. You can't really look at any individual forecast and judge the quality of it. You can only use statistics when you look at things like this. But this bottom case here we call optimistic or pessimistic, and this upper case we call overconfident. So these are two measures of what a good quality forecast should look like. We will use scoring rules to measure the quality of these forecasts. Where do we get these scoring rules from? Well, these scoring rules are quite commonly used in other industries. In meteorology and other industries where forecasting is at least as critical as it is in our industry. So we're just borrowing rules that have been applied for many, many years in other industries. And that these rules measure the accuracy of probabilistic forecasts. There are many scoring rules or scoring methods available. This is one measure that's quite commonly used in oil and gas, but it's not really applicable to probabilistic forecasts. The mean absolute error or the absolute percentage error, they're not directly applicable to probabilistic forecasts, so we're not going to use those. We want a so-called proper scoring method, and I'm not going to get into too much detail here, but the proper scoring method basically encourages the forecaster to forecast his or her true beliefs. That's what the proper scoring method is doing. It needs to be scale invariant. And that's, of course, an issue in our case, because these fields are at very different volumes with very different volume in the production. If you look at the forecast of, say, rain tomorrow, also probability of rain tomorrow, it's on the same scale, right? But in our case, it's not on the same scale, so we need to somehow make the forecast scale invariant. And we will use the continuous ranked probability score, which is also commonly used score in other industries, and is generalizing this mean absolute error score in the case of probabilistic forecasts. So that's a score we will use. And this is the way it looks. So imagine that your forecast is represented by density here, or a continuous distribution shown by the f of x here, continuous distribution. And then you have an actual outcome, which is a single value. So I have a continuous distribution over the production, say, in year 3. Then the actual production in year 3, of course, will be a single value y. And then this score here is basically the difference between the forecast and the actual outcome, as represented by red here, and mathematical notation is this integral of the difference. Now, of course, we don't have a density, do we? The companies are not providing a density or continuous distribution to the Petroleum Directorate. What they are providing is a triplet. So we got 3 values, which is not really a density. So we need to fit a density to this in order to work with the CRPS. And then there are, of course, many continuous distributions you could think about using here, but it needs to be one that works with the triplet forecast. So can I use a normal distribution? No, not really, because I cannot fit that to 3 numbers. Can I use a log normal? No, not really, because again, that is completely determined by the mean and standard deviation, not by 3 numbers. And there aren't really any other forecasts out there that allow you to fit things to 3 percentiles or to the 2 percentiles and the mean. So there's a newly introduced forecast called the meta-log distribution that was presented by Tom Killeen in 2016 that we have used here. And that allows us, that's based on the series expansion, as it says up here. and the number of terms depends on the number of data points. In this case, we got 3 data points. We got the P10, we got the P90, and we got the mean. Now, of course, the 3 data points that's required to use the meta log in our case would be the P10, P90, and the P50. And we don't really have the P50, but we can work with the mean in order to get the correct P50. So we can basically try different P50s until we find a P50 that makes the average distribution equal to the mean forecast. And that's what we've done here, and we ran through. So if you look at these 72 fields, 10 years production, that gives us, if I add that up, I get about 700 or so forecasts. Not going to be quite that much because some of the years didn't really have as many as 72. But we have several hundred forecasts here, so we ran a loop over this and we did optimization so that for each of these forecasts, the mean is within 1% of the forecasted mean. So that's how we fitted this. So now we have a P10, a P50, and a P90. And it should go without saying here that these distributions are asymmetric. Most of the distributions are asymmetric. If they hadn't been, we could just have used a normal distribution. And then we make the CRPS scale independent by applying a log transform to the percentiles of the meta log. It's not quite as simple as it sounds like here, but this is effectively how we make it scale invariant. So now we have a density forecast for each field for each year. And then we're going to introduce another measure that's commonly used in meteorology and other forecasting industries, which is called the skill score. And the skill score is kind of like a self-describing name, isn't it? It kind of like describe the skill. It scores the skill of the forecaster. And the skill score is a ratio of this CRPS measure. So it's a reference minus the actual forecast divided by the reference. So let me add some detail to this. So the reference here is a forecast which does not require any skill, effort, or knowledge to prepare. So being a reservoir engineer, that's the kind of a forecast I could ask my 20-year-old son to produce. He doesn't really have any skill about reservoirs or oil and gas at all, except that he knows that oil and gas is a bad thing, but he certainly has no skills about, the subsurface, geology, petrophysics, and stuff like that. But he could generate some sort of a reference forecast. An example in meteorology would be a forecast, which is say the forecast entity is temperature. Then a reference forecast would be a forecast that's based only on average temperatures for the particular location for each day. And this, of course, doesn't require any meteorological skills or knowledge, right? Again, I could ask my 20-year-old son to go, so why don't you just look up the statistics? Why don't you do some Googling for San Francisco and find what is the average temperature on May the 4th for the past 20 years? Or what is the temperature for May the 4th of the past 20 years, and take the average of this, and let's use that as our forecast, right? That would be the reference forecast. And we certainly would want to be better than that, don't we? We certainly want our forecast to be better than that. I mean, I got many, many years in universities learning to be, a very good reservoir engineer. Surely I should be able to beat my 20-year-old son who knows nothing about forecasting. But the question we need to face here then, this is kind of easy enough, I guess, in meteorological forecasting, but what about oil and gas? How do we come up with a reasonable reference forecast in oil and gas? Before I go there, I'm actually going to try to put some meaning into these skill scores. So it could be 1. So a skill score of 1 is actually a perfect skill score. That means there really is no uncertainty, because it means that the density really is a step change and it falls exactly on the outcome. A skill score of 0, that means that the difference between a reference forecast and the actual forecast, or the difference between the reference and the actual forecast is 0, right? Or is 0. That means no skill. So that would be the skill score of my son, my 20-year-old son. But then you could also have a negative here, which is worse than a reference. So if you fall in below 0, then you are doing worse than a reference. And again, that's not really where we want to be. And Coming from the world of decision making, I like to categorize things in terms of the quality of a decision. So if a forecast is in a range between 0 and 1, that is going to be useful for decision making, useful in a sense of improving the quality of a decision. If it's right there, it's going to be useless, doesn't really add any value, nor does it destroy any value. So make the same decision whether we have this forecast or not, right? Because our forecast is effectively the reference. And then we got this region here where we are worse than useless. And worse than useless here means making decisions that are worse. Creates less value than they would have done if we had just used a reference forecast. So we don't want to be in that lower region, do we? For reference, in this case, we use 17 abandoned fields. So as of 2020, there were 17 fields that had been abandoned on the Norwegian continental shelf. And then we normalized these so they all had a life of 1 year and the area under the curve was 1. And then with this reference forecast or this reference production profile, we could then fit every forecast to this. That allows us to calculate the skill score that I just showed you. So doing that, we end up with this. So I got 3 regions in here. I got a green region, which is skills. I got a reddish region, which is no skills. And then I got the orange region. I'm sorry, I got the reddish region, which is negative skills. And I got the orange region, which is no skills. And here I've said, well, it doesn't have to be exactly 0. If the skill score is somewhere between minus 0.1 and plus 0.1, let's group it into this no skills here. And then on the horizontal axis of this graph, I got the number of production years. So this is the cumulative production after 2 years, cumulative production after 3 years, and so on. And here we see the fraction of forecast. And what do we see here? Well, we see that about half of the forecast, only about half of the forecasts are useful. So it's only the green stuff that's useful. The red stuff is value destroying. So yeah, this is kind of where things started getting surprising from the analysis of our data. This was not a very encouraging message, was it? That this is how it looks over a lot of fields. We can also look at percentile statistics to get some more insights in this, so we can compare actual outcomes with forecasted percentiles. So we have these P10 and P50 and P90 percentiles. So I'm looking in at P10 here, right? So here got production year on the horizontal axis. I got the fraction over here, so the P10 would fall here, right? This is a P10. So if I look at the forecasted P10 across all these fields, how many should fall below that orange line? And of course, all of you will immediately say 10%. About 10% should fall on or below that line. If I look at the actual outcomes, not really 10%. It's a lot more, right? It's almost 60% here for after 2 years of cumulative. It improves, goes down to about 30 or 33% or something after 5 years cumulative. And it hovers around here and then, yeah, doesn't really get much better, does it? So when we say that there's a 10% chance, this is a P10, the 10% chance that the actual production will be below, looks like there's 50, 60, 40, at least 30% chance that the actual production will be below that line, which is an indication of both optimism and overconfidence. We can also look at the 80% range. So how many of these fall within the P90, P10 range? That should be 80%, right? That's kind of like the definition of an 80% range is 80%. So 80% of the actual outcomes should fall within that range. If I look at the actual outcome here, we see that here about 26% fall within, about 45, it goes up as high as maybe 57, 56 or something, and so on, right? And it kind of like hovers around 50, 55%. So if I look at the average of this thing, I guess one slightly different way of articulating that is that when a reservoir forecaster says that he or she is 80% sure that the production will be in this range, he really is only about 45-50% sure. Right? So seems to be an incredible level of overconfidence, as if the forecaster knows more than he or she actually does. Okay, so far so good. So an obvious question to ask here, given that we got these forecasts all the way from the early 90s through 2020, is has quality improved over the 3 decades they investigated? And the, my intuitive feeling would be, yeah, sure. When I did forecasting back in the mid 80s, I think our methods were really crude. We didn't use the word uncertainty. We used single value numbers, etc. on this. And I know there's been a tremendous effort into developing probabilistic methods since then, as well as more advanced, richer mathematical simulation tools. So I would expect an improvement over these almost 3 decades. Well, we're going to look at that by looking at what many companies call production attainment. So this ratio we see on the vertical axis here is the cumulative actual production divided by the mean forecast. And then we're looking at the FID year, 85 through 2020. So if I draw a line here at 1, that means that the cumulative forecast, the cumulative production, the cumulative actual production is equal to the mean forecast. So then I can throw out all of these fields out here. So each marker represents a field. The marker size here happens to be proportional to the covered oil volume. That's not really important for our discussion. So you can look at this scatter and you can try to make a judgment. So if this kind of like stays at 1 here, I guess that's a good thing. Then it's been constant. If it starts down here and goes up, that's a good thing, because then things are improving, right? And if it starts up here and goes down, that's a bad thing, because then things are getting worse. Well, so we need to do some regression in here, right? So the green line there is a linear regression, which has got a negative gradient. Now, of course, linear regressions are pretty heavily influenced by outliers. So we also did a support vector regression on this, which is a red line. So whether you like to believe in the green line or the red line is not really very important, but back to our question, has the quality of production forecast improved over this time period? And when I look at this graph, the only conclusion I can make is no, not really. If anything, they are worse, despite the effort we have taken to put into probabilistic or improved probabilistic forecasts. So I could imagine myself. So I've been in this industry for more than 30 years, but I could imagine myself on my retirement party being presented by a graph like this, where my boss says, Radar, here is your results after 30 years in our company. Here's what you have achieved when it comes to your main responsibility, namely production forecasting. And I think I should, I don't think I would party way into the evening that day if that were to happen. And I don't think this is an individual issue, so I don't think people are stupid. I think I would have made the same mistake or they had the same biases, if you like, if I'd been in this forecasting situation. I think it's more systematic. I think it has to do with the fact that many companies don't take this seriously enough. They don't go back and check. It's not being discussed at the annual review conversations and things like that. So I don't think this is an individual thing, because we as individuals we have all kinds of cognitive biases. We can't help ourselves for being optimistic and overconfident quite often. So there's something about the system itself that makes this happen. Anyway, the consequences of this are, of course, if I look at the production stuff like this, I got the forecast in blue and the actual in orange. If I look at the cost forecast, got the same type of issues, overconfidence and optimism. Now they're shifted in the opposite direction, so we tend to, our cost estimates tend to be lower than the actual outcomes. And if I look at time to deliver products, it also tends to be optimistic. Our forecasts are shorter than the actual time it takes. And what's the result of this? Value erosion. By definition, the result is value erosion. Biased forecasts lead to value erosion. Again, these forecasts have no value in and of themselves. If these forecasts will never be used in a decision-making context, then why make them? Well, I guess you could make them for regulatory purposes, but really the main reason for coming up with these forecasts is to support decision-making. So they must hold the potential to change decisions. So biased forecasts lead to suboptimal decisions and value erosion. Value erosion does not mean value loss. It doesn't mean that these products would are negative, are NPV negative, not at all. It just means that they could have been more valuable than they end up being. If we had had a better forecast of production, maybe we would have chosen different fields to develop. And even if we had chosen the same fields to develop, maybe we would have come up with different concepts, done it in different ways than we currently are doing. So this definitely leads to value erosion, and a significant value erosion as well. So how can we fix the problem? How can we reduce these biases? Again, we got limited time in here, but you can imagine several ways of doing this. We have looked at one particular way of doing it, and that's called reference class forecasting. And this is getting to be old stuff. This was developed or suggested by Kahneman and Tversky as early as in 1976. Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in economics in 2002. Tversky didn't get the Nobel Prize in economics because he passed away in 1997. But they basically tell us that typically when we forecast for a project, whether we forecast cost, time, or benefits, we take the inside view. So we make predictions based on a subjective and detailed understanding of the project itself. And then we should complement that inside view with what's called the outside view, which ignores the details of the specific projects and rather makes a prediction based on data from other similar projects. This has been used in other industries, seems to work well. And we're going to demonstrate how well it works here. So we're going to use all the fields on the continental shelf that have FID forecasts and actual production history. That will be our reference class. Just to make sure we all have the same understanding in here. So again, we got limited time, so I cannot get into all details here, but say that this horizontal axis represent the forecasted percentile. I call it plotting position here, and this is like a PP plot for those of you who are familiar with PP plots. But this is then a percentile forecast, and this is then the outcome frequency. Then, of course, if you got perfect forecast, you should fall on the black line here. If all the forecasts were perfect, then it would fall on the black line. That is completely unrealistic, because if that was the case, then that means there's no uncertainty involved in the system. And of course, there's uncertainty involved in the system. The blue line there with the markers represent a forecast, or a set of forecasts, I should rather say, a data set that is not perfect, right? You see it's quite far off from a perfect forecast. And what we want to do that is we kind of want to push this thing closer to the black line. We want to push this up to the left. We want to push this down to the right. So we want to achieve something like this, shown in the orange line here with the marker, right? So it's completely unrealistic to believe that we're going to fall on the black line, but we want to hover around that black 45-degree line. We have used two models for reference class calibration. Both of these two methods provide us with a P10, a mean, and a P90 forecast. In the first one, model 1, we only use the mean forecast. We ignore the P10 and P90 forecast. We only use the mean forecast to generate these three. In the second method, we used all three forecasts, P10, mean, and P90, to generate three updated or calibrated forecasts. Again, we're skipping a lot of detail in here. So if I then look at the end of year 2, well, before I go there, let me focus in on the title first. So then we look at these verification plots, and here we did tenfold cross-validation. So I said we used all of the data on the NCS as a reference class. Well, what we actually do is that we select training data and forecast data. Right, and then we do a tenfold cross-validation on which part of the data set do we use as training and for forecasting. How large is the training compared to the forecast, etc. So we do a pretty rich cross-validation in here. So here then you see the actual forecast after the end of year 2. And you can see it's far, far off the perfect, and that kind of fits with what we have discussed so far. And here, if you see when I'm applying the calibration methods, I get the orange and green forecasts, which are much, much closer to the perfect. And also, if I just use a reference, and the reference here are the 17 abandoned fields. If I just use that reference adjusted for the actual field, I'll get the reddish here, which is again much, much better than the actual forecast. Again, so if this actual forecast here represents my skill, a reservoir engineer with a PhD, and this orange here represents my son's skills, with who is a first-year university student, not in reservoir engineering or petroleum engineering. This is a pretty sad story, isn't it? My completely uneducated son who doesn't understand anything is doing significantly better than I'm doing, and I got a PhD. So that's not sure I would like to hear that story. I can also look at the same here at the end of year 3 and end of year 4, and again we see that things are bad, and we see that this reference class forecasting is really doing a fantastic job in bringing this up to the 45-degree line. So it's very impressive in how effective it is, and it's quite robust, and it works really well for all the data we've been looking at. We can also look at the percentile plots. So here we got the below P10 again. Here's the uncalibrated, and when we calibrate things, you see that we get a lot closer to getting these actually at the P10 line, don't we? And even the 17 abandoned fields is much closer to reality than the actual forecasted data, and we can have get the same type of conclusions if you look at the P10 to P90 or the 80% interval. So again, reference class forecasting seems to be quite robust, and it's also quite simple. It's an easy way of calibrating forecasters. So let's take this to a conclusion. Yep, I've repeated this a few times now, but I'm amazed at how many times I need to repeat this when I talk to oil and gas companies. The only reason for doing these forecasts is to support decisions, and they are absolutely required in order to make good decisions. We have concluded these forecasts on the NCS are optimistic and overconfident. And I believe that if they're optimistic and overconfident on the NCS, they're probably optimistic and overconfident in the rest of the world as well. There have been some studies of deterministic forecasts. I don't think I've seen any public studies of probabilistic production forecasts. But I suspect that things in other parts of the world are at least as optimistic and overconfident as they are on the NCS. About half of the forecasts are worse than useless and lead to value erosion. I think the forecast that I was involved in providing to the Gulf XP development was worse than useless and led to value erosion. I'm pretty convinced about that. The biases have not been reduced over the 3 decades investigated, despite all the resources and money spent moving to probabilistic forecasts. Oil and gas companies have a ton of PhDs, right, with degrees in math and statistics and whatnot. and they're spending a lot of time and money coming up with these very complex, very rich models that supposedly help us come up with better forecasts. And I'm a big fan of probabilistic forecasting, so the conclusion of this study is not that probabilistic forecasting should be abandoned. The argument really is that the current approach, with a focus on developing these ever more sophisticated methods for quantifying future production, is not the right approach. We need to change something in order to become better calibrated. Yeah, so we haven't really made those additional changes, right? We haven't really come up with efforts in developing methods or procedures to assess the performance of these forecasts. And of course, to do that, we need to keep score, don't we? We need to track the forecast performance. We need to provide feedback. And I've been visiting quite a few operators over the past 4 or 5 years talking about this, and I'm very surprised by the number of companies who are surprised about how poor their forecasts were, which is the same thing as telling me that they don't really keep track. They thought their forecasts were good, so they don't keep score. They don't track forecasting performance. How can these biases be reduced? Well, we talked about reference class forecasting. Provides a simple and robust means for calibration and significantly reduces cognitive, motivational, organizational biases. We're not suggesting that this is the only way of doing it, but this is one simple, straightforward, easy, quick way of doing it. And if we haven't been able to do this over the past 30 years, then at least we should try to do this. Despite that, people in oil and gas companies really don't like this method. They feel it is way too much of a brute force, non-scientific method. So let's just remind you then that Daniel Kahneman, in his 2011 book, wrote that reference class forecasting may be considered the single most important piece of advice regarding how to increase accuracy in forecasting. And that's my last slide. So thanks a lot for listening, and I do hope we have time for questions.
Perfect. So we actually got a lot of questions here, Reidar, and thanks again for the presentation. Really interesting. And I think, you know, at least what I see when we work with clients and stuff as well is you're always competing for capital, either in the market to raise capital for justifying a development, or internally in a company. You know, you're subject to capital allocation and whatnot. So you need, you know, sometimes it's this competition of having the most optimistic forecast. Everybody wants the forecast to be good, like the investors, the analysts, the market, you know, your managers, etc. So it's this kind of collective, not effort, but this collective thing that makes our kind of a group decision to be very optimistic in general. As that's do you have any comments related to that, or can you understand that from that perspective, that, you know, it's this pressure to always show great results to your boss, or to the investors or whatnot, and then you actually are, you know, when someone will actually evaluate your forecast, then maybe you are a manager at that point, and maybe your old boss is now not in the company anymore, and maybe the oil price has changed to 2x, either up or down, so you can now either blame, or maybe you were saved by the oil price in that scenario, etc.
Yep, I hear this argument quite often. I hear people telling me that we need to be optimistic and overconfident in our forecast, because if not, that project will not be approved. I mean, the immediate response is that well, if you are realistic in your forecast and your product is not approved, that probably makes sense. It shouldn't be approved. Another comment is that if all the forecasts are optimistic, then a company cannot afford to invest in all of the products. So then it will invest in a subset of all of those optimistic products. And so it takes the most optimistic of all these optimistic products. And it's almost guaranteed to not deliver on its promises. Right? The procedure makes it almost impossible to deliver on the promises. And if I was an investor in a company who continues to offer or promise a return at a certain level, and then repeatedly is unable to do that, I would move my money elsewhere. I wouldn't invest in that company. It may well deliver good returns, but it indicates to me there's some sort of a corporate lying game within the corporation that is not optimal for high quality decision making. It doesn't really benefit the investors. It doesn't benefit the company. So I would move away from that.
And then in general, do you think, like, I know the shale industry has been kind of subject to that criticism from kind of Wall Street and whatnot the last few years, and it looks like they've really tightened up their game on at least some of those parts. But you kind of see that this is, that inherent problem also there?
Yes, I do think so. I think it's an inherent problem in every industry where forecasting is at play, and I think the industries that have succeeded in dealing with it are industries which have realized it and started keeping track and keeping score. If you look at weather forecasting in the US, for example, where they forecast, the rainfall and stuff like that, the tomorrow and the day after and the day after, they back in the 1970s, they realized that the forecast was so bad that they couldn't be trusted for anything. So then they went through a massive retraining, education and retraining exercise to improve things. And in addition to that, they started incentivizing the meteorologists for the quality of the forecast. Right. So if you look at the forecast over the past year, then that's going to play into whether you get your bonus, whether you're being promoted, etc. Right. So that shows the importance of it. In the oil and gas industry, when most of us go there, walk into our boss's office for the annual conversation, the annual review, we don't talk about the forecasts. The boss doesn't show me the quality of my forecasts over the past year, over the past 5 years. It's not a part of the conversation. Many of the forecasters or that's what engineers that I've been talking with in different companies are not even clear about how the forecast will be used. It's unclear how they will be used, whether it will be used in the shape that they hand them over, whether they will be modified, etc. So that is the same thing as telling the forecasters that this stuff is not important. I don't really care much about your forecast. Yeah, I got to do it, but that's just for the sake of doing it. It's not an important thing in the organization. It's not important for us. And of course, if that's the impression of the organization, then why should I care? Why should I care? What I probably should do then is to ask my 20-year-old son to do it instead, right? So.
As well, just before we go on to a few other questions, a lot of people have asked if they can get a copy of the presentation. So will that be available for distribution after the presentation today?
Yeah, actually, what I would prefer to do is to give you. So we written a couple of papers on this, and I could share the papers.
Okay.
Because then you get the the figures are in the papers, and then you get a better description of things as well, rather than just looking at the graphs.
Yeah, sounds great. Very good. I think a lot of the other questions here, they have a lot of common denominators, and I think you mentioned that back in when you were in Equinor and stuff, you started to use reservoir simulators and these kind of things, and now versus what we did back then, even though maybe our forecasts, as you mentioned in one of your graphs, are worse, we have more sophisticated tools available to us, but it doesn't seem like those tools are necessarily helped us in the right direction always, because you still see a very common exercise actually among our clients and a lot of people in the industry is that they have some decline forecast that they've empirically forecasted with some, call it ARPS, B parameters, etc. And they're actually trying to history match their reservoir simulation model to the empirical forecast, which is kind of the opposite of what you would probably kind of expect. So do you have any comments related to kind of the use of new technology and the promise of new technology potentially making the decisions much better, or that's the promise, but in reality, it's actually the opposite?
Yeah, I think I have a lot of thoughts and comments on it. So I mean, I'm also a PhD, as I mentioned earlier, right, with a math background, and I really like my models. I love my models. I don't want to give up my models. So if I'm in that world, it's kind of like the model has a life in itself. It has a value in itself, and I don't really care whether other people are going to use them or not. In some sense, right? I'm not willing to give up my model. But I think for every time I suggest that we should spend money on adding a new feature or develop a new model, we need to somehow ask ourselves and investigate whether it works. the obvious question to ask is, does it work? Right? And then, of course, we need to define what we mean by does it work. And I'll try to define that in this context, right? That is to provide high quality forecasts. And if it doesn't do that, then we shouldn't use it, right? So yes, okay to start new features, add new features, start new products, but you need to almost from the start evaluate where it actually improves things, where it works. And if it doesn't, then you either need to change something or you need to kill it. You can't just say, well, but these models are so much more sophisticated than the models we had 20 years ago. They got so much more math in them than the models we had 20 years ago. That is not an argument saying that they will do better or that they work.
Mm.
Having said that, I'm also a big fan, of course, of a proper probabilistic modeling approach. So I'm not a big believer in taking classical deterministic models like many of our SVR simulators and then wrap some Monte Carlo method or ensemble method around them and believe that you're going to get good probabilistic forecasts. Because these models tend to be so detailed in a deterministic sense that they're really difficult to treat for probabilistic models, for probabilistic forecasting. So I'm very impressed by some models, and I'm not going to mention names here, but there are some companies that have, come into play over the past 10 years or so who have taken a much more probabilistic forecast from day one. And I'm a much bigger believer in that approach. But no matter what the approach is, we always need to ask, does it work?
Mm. Very good. So just in respect of everyone's time, I think we'll, any other questions, feel free to follow up with Reidar offline. I think a lot of the questions that at least we got in the Q&A and chat channels here, they were very similar in nature. I definitely learned a lot and would like to thank you again, Reidar, for joining us today. Just before we end the session, Curtis, any comments or last questions from you?
I mean, it was very interesting to me as well, and I left a question on the Q&A that Reidar hopefully will get a chance to look at and respond to that basically just says if you superimpose the uncertainty of price on the products of your cums that you've used as a value parameter, the barrel, so to speak, if you superimpose the uncertainty in the price forecasting, how do things change? But you don't need to go into that now, but we could take that offline. I just think it's a great thing what you're doing. It was very clear. I think the underlining, what you should be thinking about instead of maybe what the workflow that we're using today, but it takes some time to digest and I think to try to implement, without having read all those papers and studied I'm sure all the many examples in those papers that prove what you recommend is worthwhile. So I look forward to trying to get started on that and really appreciate your presentation. And I'll remind you, you wrote your own simulation model which I used in one of my publications for forecasting a small gas well in Oklahoma some years back. So we're all guilty, I guess, of doing what you talked about. And thank you again, Reidar.
Thanks, Curtis.
Perfect.
And thanks
So,
thanks to both of you for inviting me. I enjoyed it. I always enjoy giving these type of talks.
Excellent. And then with that, thanks also to all our participants today. We'll distribute both the recording here in the aftermath of the presentation a little bit later today, and wish everybody still a great Wednesday. Thanks a lot.